Hello, guys and gals, me Mutahar, and Canada went offline. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I wanted to make this video a sort of an educational piece. What happens when nearly 35% of the country loses their internet service? Now, for all of you who don't know, I'm from Canada, one of the largest first world countries in the world. And when people are always like, but Muta, the internet's like always available, it's always there. When it's not, which is exactly what Canadians had to deal with, a good chunk of them, me included, when our entire internet and mobile services were completely cut off. So to give you some background and context, Canada, while it is a first world country, and I absolutely love a lot of things about it, it is a country with an absolute monopoly on telecom services. If you're in Canada, you really only have four, companies to pick from. It's kind of like flying in an airline company. It's just who fists you the less, right? So basically, when it comes to telecommunications in Canada, we have companies like Rogers Communications, which is the one affected in this case, Bell Canada, TELUS Corporation, Shaw Communications, and if you live in the old French side of Canada, you've got Quebecor Incorporated. So again, to understand, for me, I have Bell Internet Home, okay? Meaning that my home internet is run by Bell. Basically, on the day of the Great Canadian Disconnect, I actually didn't lose my home internet connection. My Wi-Fi still worked, I could play matches of Rainbow Six Siege, but as long as it came to my actual cell phone device, this, ladies and gentlemen, was completely offline. In fact, up here in the corner, it straight up said, no service. So the reason that happened was somewhere around 5 in the morning, about a day or two ago, Canada's telecom company, Rogers, basically was unable to provide service, both from a mobile perspective and home internet, to their average users. So to understand, in Canada, 32% of the mobile market share literally belongs to Rogers, okay? So from a mobile perspective, 32% of the country was completely disconnected. It's a country with 36.09 million mobile cellular subscriptions in all throughout the country, which is a lot. But of course, ladies and gentlemen, to move on from this situation, let's go understand just how such a thing could occur. So when it comes to the monopoly in Canada, we really don't have much to pick from. There's a lot of third-party providers in Canada, but a lot of them backbone off of the big four. So again, that's how bad the scape of competition is, okay? And when there's really no competition, you can be as inefficient and as lackadaisy as you really want to. But of course, there's multiple sides to a story. If you were there yesterday, you must have witnessed that even other companies were literally shitting on Rogers in a tongue-in-cheek way. For instance, TELUS literally told every Canadian, save $100 by switching to a network that won't leave you hanging. God damn, that's a little below the belt right there, Jesus Christ. But of course, all these companies were still willing to help Rogers out when they needed to. Some people were like, how are you even tweeting? Are you using Bell? Which Rogers was giving us updates throughout the days. Guys, their satellite internet. They're backupping on satellite internet to communicate with the rest of the world and the various teams they have across the country. But of course, at some point later on, well, I would say like 10 o'clock later the night of the Great Canadian Disconnect, I started to get service back. Rogers started showing up in the top right of my phone, top left, and of course, I saw the words 5G, which meant that I was at least able to connect to a network. I wasn't able to get any websites going up, and at some point later in the night, it went from 5G to like 4G to LTE, all the way down to like Edge. It was just going all over the place. The whole network in my region wasn't fixed until early this morning. So like 6 o'clock a.m., 7 o'clock is when the network was there. We were basically disconnected for effectively an entire 24 hours. Now, Rogers' president came out and basically said, to our valued customers and all Canadians, I'll get at it with the PR speak, I want to share that all services have been restored and our network and systems are close to fully operational. Close to fully operational, meaning that things were still being worked on in the pipeline, obviously. So of course, I want to share what happened yesterday. We now believe we've narrowed the cause to a network system failure following a maintenance update in our core network. Now, of course, I want to use this situation to teach people how this can happen. So what really happened? Was it a massive cyber attack? Not really. What effectively did happen was a bad configuration. Now, for those people who don't know about the internet, the way that the internet works is we use something known as BGP, which for those of you who don't know is Border Gateway Protocol. In a layman's term, in the simplest way to explain this, I'm going to tell you how BGP works, okay? So Border Gateway Protocol effectively exchanges routing information between things known as ASs, or autonomous systems. So basically, a quick way to look at it is think of it like a big router. You all have a router or a modem in your house, right, that lets your computer connect to the internet. This is the router that basically exchanges all the data from your ISP to your cell phone, to your computer, to every internet-connected device, network-connected device in your house. Because of routers, we're able to route actual traffic. So when you have big routers in this case that effectively run the internet. Remember, the internet is basically a network of networks. So effectively what's kind of happening is these big routers are communicating with other big routers. So think of BGP as sort of a connecting point in this situation. What had happened was, because of a bad configuration or a bad update, as far as my assessment goes, Rogers hasn't straight up said this, Rogers couldn't even advertise basically that it even existed to the other networks on the system. So what had happened was, if you have like all the other ISPs in the world, right? Like for instance in Canada, Bell, TELUS, basically any ISP, all of a sudden, they couldn't even see Rogers on the network. And because they couldn't see Rogers on the network, every other internet provider, ISP, couldn't communicate back and forth. Effectively, if you were on the Rogers network, you could not communicate with the other networks around you. That's how the internet works. We're just networks connected to other networks, and we share all this information together. Now, every single network in the world has what we call an ASN, which is an autonomous system number. And effectively, in this case, Rogers is identified as AS812 on the entire network. So of course, you can see that they've got 21,000 hosted domains, 5.4 million IP addresses. So how does it look like when the system goes fully belly up? So here I got something called BG Play, which is RIPE NCC. What this is going to do is it's going to show you a live showcase of how the BGP was operating. So in this case, we're looking at 812, right? This is AS812. In this case, this is Rogers, right? So of course, 2 days before, Rogers was communicating just fine and dandy to everybody around it. Now, of course, at some point at 5 in the morning, what had started to happen was the Rogers 812 system had slowly started to go offline. Eventually, going a little bit forward, before this crashes my browser because it has a lot of stuff to calculate, Rogers effectively got disconnected. And of course, throughout the rest of the day, it was the engineers working at Rogers were basically trying to fix whatever update they passed. So at this point, everyone who's on this network, meaning me and various other millions of users, were basically blind to the rest of the world. We could not communicate to anybody. Of course, later on, as the network started to come back, it then was given a proper update. The engineers looked at it, and all of a sudden, this node was fixed and it started to communicate with everybody else around it. Now, of course, ladies and gentlemen, this was a misconfiguration in the entire system. And what it actually started to showcase is that these systems are incredibly fragile. Now, even if this wasn't a cyber attack, what it actually basically come out is that, listen, ladies and gentlemen, when the internet goes down, a lot of things end up being affected. In Canada's case, we actually lost quite a few things that day. Now, of course, this ended up being a misconfiguration that the engineers spent hours upon hours fixing up. No doubt in my mind, the people who were working behind this, fixing it back in the back end, were absolutely going through hell for the last 24 hours. And the system is back up and everything seems to be working just fine. But let me explain what happens. This has proven that the internet infrastructure is incredibly fragile, and a bad misconfiguration can absolutely cause some pandemonium, even if it is for just one day. See, ladies and gentlemen, what had actually happened when this system went down was it wasn't just we stopped communicating or calling or texting one another. A lot of backbones, remember, this is the internet backbone, okay, the ISP backbone, one of the big four in the monopoly. Because one of them went down, places like passport services couldn't process things because they had no network connectivity. If you were somebody who worked in finance, right, and let's say that you were doing like a payment on a debit machine or a credit machine, that debit credit machine would use Rogers as a communication backend to process the transaction. Well, because the entire network shut down, the BGP failure occurred, well, we couldn't actually then process those transactions. And of course, you can imagine if this process went on for days, it was actually a rumor that this wasn't going to be fixed until Monday, which is total bullshit. If it turns out, like, if this had lasted for 4 or 5 days, pandemonium would have went through the roof. People were already considering porting their numbers over and switching cell phone providers just with 24 hours of network failure. And of course, there's no there's no shame in that. I was almost considering switching to another provider simply because I couldn't even get my two-factor authentication numbers on it because I use Rogers for that specific cell phone device. Of course, ladies and gentlemen, the internet can be quite a fragile place, but hopefully this video has kind of taught you what effectively happened. We literally had a misconfiguration, yes, one misconfiguration it seems, that caused the entire backbone to drop the way that it did. So yes, for Canadians, it's one thing to learn from, and it's one thing to understand that it's not the fact that we're just relying on technology, it's that the technology in the back end, especially when it's done through a monopoly that's backed by the government. Let's be honest here, Canadians, okay? The Canadian government backs these forced scumbag monopolies, and they barely do anything to update their systems. They barely do anything to mitigate crap like this. Of course, the mitigation aspect is something that I wanted to cover on too. I really feel like if this ever happens in the future, we need to find a really quick way to have companies immediately try migrating their affected users onto other cell phone providers. If you're going to run a monopoly, at least work together in making sure that the average person doesn't lose their connections, especially at critical moments. See, forget the banking stuff. Forget even the passport stuff. If you can't make a 911 call because your network infrastructure is down, that's bad fucking news. Ladies and gentlemen, that was an interesting little look at why Canada went offline, at least a chunk of the country, and hopefully you learned something about it too. I know sometimes these tech videos can be a little dry, but I really like to take these complex, points and really try to simplify them so that really anybody can understand it, okay? It is what it is. Ladies and gentlemen, this is what happened. If you like what you saw, please like, comment, and subscribe. Dislike it. If you dislike it, I am out.